a variety of sectors, and now we're actually going to focus on what is happening within the workforce of the New York City. And the next speaker is going to be our very own Patrick Boyle. He is the director of the research units at the EEPC. And just to give you an idea of what the research unit of the EEPC does, we collect and manage primary and secondary data. We develop tools and databases, and we analyze data using quantitative and qualitative methods, looking at trends and anomalies. And we try to communicate these findings and recommendations to stakeholders through reports, presentations, conferences, and hearings. And we try to conduct proactive and self-reflective strategies to ensure the best possible processes. In addition to this, we lend our support to the other units of the EEPC, including the audit, primarily the audit unit, while in the aid for them to come up with their tools to audit agencies, we assist in that process. So without further ado, Dr. Patrick Boyle.
Hi everyone, how are you doing? So in the interest of time, I'm going to move pretty quickly. Our other speakers will be leaving, but I'm always here at Oregon City, so you know where to find me. My business card's in all of your folders, so feel free to reach out. A little concerned that the other speakers keep on talking about the devil in the details. My presentation has a lot of details in it, and yes. And while Don was kind enough to keep you from formulas, I am not doing the same. You're going to see an arithmetic formula that is really not as bad as it seems. So, in the research unit, we look at all sorts of issues about equal opportunity. And we felt this was a very, very unseen topic that was very important to bring up, and we're doing a lot of research on it right now, currently writing a report, and of course making everyone here aware of something that some people don't always associate with the gender and racial wage gap. But our objectives here are to inform agencies, mostly, and ensure that there is a much better awareness, encourage discussions about succession planning, some very important aspects of EEO programs and HR professionals, and identify potential risks, because there are risks inherent with having imbalances in the workforce. What we've done is based our research, it's not comprehensive. We haven't completed it yet. We've structured it around particular research questions that we feel are really important. And what I would ask of all of you is to continue to come up with questions and continue to look at your processes, because that's really how we're going to spread awareness and really develop a more broad research agenda. So please think of that as we go through this. A lot of the research that we're doing, we've pulled it from many different places. It's I think it's one of the best ways to get a full picture of the numbers you have. You don't want to pull on just one data source. So what we used is we used the SEEDS reports many of you are familiar with, workforce composition, personnel actions, utilization, civil service status. However, unfortunately, SEEDS excludes the Department of Education, Health and Hospitals, and School Construction Authority. So keep in mind that those will not be included in our analysis of some of our numbers and using that. We've leveraged information from NYSERS, we've looked at title specifications, even court decisions about different things that we needed to know to really understand what we were measuring. We used the DCAS Workforce Profile Report. The 2016 report is the most recent one. We used a lot of information from that. And we've used census data, the American Community Survey, a very small subset of that. The basic analyses that we've done are workforce headcounts. We've just looked at the numbers of people and try to see what sort of imbalances we have. And as you've seen in other presentations, the index of dissimilarity, or the dissimilarity index, plays a large role in the research that we've done. Therefore, I'm going to get into it a little bit more than my predecessors did. You'll have to bear with me, but we can always go back and talk about this. So, dissimilarity index, it measures the distribution of two groups across a defined set of categories. So, they need to be two groups, all right? And you can look at them over these different categories, such as titles or job groups, just like you could with housing segregation, neighborhoods. Okay, you've got different groups over particular neighborhoods. So Queens, Bronx, different boroughs, whatever categories you want to, but this dissimilarity index is farther from that sort of housing segregation analysis. What it is, it's the sum of all the imbalances in a workforce, and it compares a proportion of each group as what we're calling as a dyad. Just the two groups, white Hispanic, men, women, white black, those sorts of dyads. Mentioned before, ranges from 0 to 1.0 or 0 to 100%, which is the number of people that would have to switch occupations in order to reach employment parity. So here, this is the formula that Don spared you from. But I want to do a little example here. So let's say we've got a 60-person organization. I'm sorry. Don't worry, it gets better. It's all downhill from here. Downhill? Yeah. It's all easier from here. It's a 60-person organization, for example. That's the department. There's 40 men, 20 women. So we're doing a gender dyad here. And there's two jobs, painter and carpenter. It's the Department of Citywide Painting and Chair Building. So it's a very specialized agency. You can see 16 women and 8 men were carpenters, 4 women and 32 men were painters. You just eyeball those numbers and you can tell something's going on here. People are not in the right jobs at the same proportion. So I've got these numbers in red. So there we go. See the number 80 there is here, 20 here, 20 purple here, 80 here. So you've got the numbers right there. There's percentages or ratios, however you're going to put them. This is how they go into the calculation. That becomes 0.6 plus 0.6 divided by 2, which becomes 1.2 divided by 2, or 0.60, 60%. Right? And that's your dissimilarity index of dissimilarity. Results, 60%, moderate to high occupational segregation. So it's substantial. Okay. Here's where we are in the city workforce. These are the comparison dyads we looked at. We looked at first gender and then all of the other corresponding race dyads. And it's 1,500 titles, 29 job groups. The titles, self-explanatory, breaks them down into individual titles. The job groups are actual groups of occupations with similar functions. For example, craft. The crafts is one of the job groups, and that would include, say, carpenters, plumbers, auto mechanics. No questions.
It is. So in order for the demographic category, the first line, where it says title and job group, in order for it to have parity, it should be 0 in both places?
Absolute and complete balanced workforce based on the number that would be 0.
Zero.
It would
So-
be 100% if there was total segregation. So if
So, so again, to your question, so anything over 50% is something that is troubling, to say at least. The whole thing's troubling. But anything over 50% is really troubling, which is why it's circled in red.
Well, with the kind of standard that we're going by, and I think this is it's fairly common to use the standard, is 0 to 30 is low, 30 to 60 moderates, 60 to 100 is high. So, like, this is on par with what Don has showed us in the past. So, but you can see that there are some things here that are outliers among the others. And there are particular groups that we should consider high priorities.
So there are more about white males in these jobs? I'm so surprised.
Not necessarily. They can get imbalanced for the opposite reason. They can be imbalanced because there's a high ratio of a particular group in a title, which actually ends up being sort of if they're all concentrated in those lower paying jobs, that's going to cause higher segregation and cause that lower or increase the gender pay gap. Okay. Here are trends over the past 5 years. Very similar. You see men, women, and white, black. Those dyads being at the top, separate from all of the others. And the next being the black Asian line there, which is really third, but still significant, less than 50. So it would be more considered moderate to low. But still, this is something that we need to address. Any sort of segregation is something worth paying attention to because it is going to contribute to a wage gap in a very significant way. So what we did was we actually broke out particular titles and particular job groups that contributed the most to the dissimilarity in this. So when you're calculating this, you can tell which of these occupations give you the highest numbers, and really it'll show you where the bulk of the segregation is. And keep in mind, we need to exclude some of the largest titles because they would basically dwarf the rest. There were the uniformed services in particular. We had to remove them because sanitation worker, corrections officer, firefighter, police officer, very, very large titles, and we didn't want to outweigh all of the others. So we're going to be getting back to the uniformed services, but other than those, you can see here what sort of titles have the greatest impact on occupational segregation. All right. First, clerical associate. Okay, you can see that in multiple, and this is in our two problem areas: the men, women, gender dyad, and the white, black race. Also, community associate. That's up there. Can you hear me if I step away from the mic? Okay. So these are a couple titles you see popping up in a number of areas and should be focused on if possible. School safety agent. There's it's a unique title, I think, and it's something that has a lot of different factors going into it. Just the nature of the title, the working hours that are required. There's a lot of things that should be considered if that's a title that your agency uses. And then caretaker. You see white, black, white, Hispanic. That's a major improvement. So when you look at the job groups, now with the job groups, you're not going to see, the dissimilarity index isn't going to be as high because the jobs are clumped together in similar jobs. So you're not comparing every single title to every single other title. You're comparing a particular job group of like jobs to a job group of other like jobs. So it's kind of taking out a little bit of the variability there. But the social worker, men and women, high concentrations of women, high concentration of blacks in those job groups. Clerical, also top contributor. Craft, we're gonna get into that in a little bit, and it's part of one of our research questions. But it's a very interesting job group. Okay, based on the trends that we looked when we were doing data exploration, we're looking at all sorts of different trends, and 4 things jumped out at us, but there are many more that need to be investigated. One of them was looking at uniform service titles, another civil service hiring practices, physically taxing jobs, and the race and ethnicity most affected by this occupational segregation. So what we want to know is, are uniformed services a large source of citywide occupational segregation? And what this does, this table shows that if we removed the uniform service titles from the calculation, what sort of change would we see? And the red actually indicates a decrease in occupational segregation. When you see red, that means that the uniform services did contribute to occupational segregation. All right? So you can take a look at the trend is, it's somewhat there, but it's not, it's multi-directional. It's not always the same sort of direction, right? When you see the white Hispanic diet at +8, that indicates that the uniform service titles actually desegregated the groups, the white Hispanic groups, okay? And so we found that it's certainly there, and these are significant numbers. Well, the black Asian is only +1, but the rest are all significant numbers, and they're very large. It's a large group of titles. So our second research question, are there trends indicating a change in citywide occupational segregation due to differences in civil service hiring practices? So, as you can imagine, HR departments are restricted in who they can hire for particular titles. Obviously, with competitive titles, you have to hire from a list. Non-competitive titles, there's a little bit more discretion in your hiring. We went into it thinking, okay, with those titles that have more discretion involved, the non-competitive titles, maybe that's where we're going to see segregation being a larger contributor. When, in fact, we ended up finding here that despite the fact that 20% of all employees are non-competitive titles, there are only 2 that were in this list of imbalanced. And when I say imbalanced, I'm going to take a quick look and point out. This table shows the majority. It's organized by the highest percent majority to the lowest percent majority. It didn't matter what the majority is, all right? For these titles, these are all majority white, but then here, as we noticed earlier, social worker is a large contributor to occupational segregation. We've got a majority of 78% black, and these are for these particular types, both in the social worker job. Hence why we saw social worker come up multiple times in that other graph. City seasonal aide, director of field operations. Those are the non-competitive titles that are in there. Okay, so you would expect to see more if that was the case, but we're not seeing a bias in these discretionary titles. We're not seeing people hire whoever they want to. So that means we need to look at other places to find out where exactly we can reduce occupational segregation. It's not an easy task, as we have learned earlier. So, when I said we were going to get back to the crafts, research question 3, do physically taxing jobs contribute to occupational segregation? Yes, yeah, they do. That's an easy one. These are the top 5 gender-skewed physically taxing titles. So, as you can see here, these four of them are craft. Job group is craft. So treatment worker, electrician, boiler, plumber, all right, and their approximate annual wages, based on the calculation of 35-hour work week, 76,000, 105,000, 103,000, 92,000. These are very high. Now, if you look at the physically taxing title here, the largest one, it's very well, it's more diverse in terms of gender. Unfortunately, approximate annual wages are $43,000. Not on par with this. And these are, I mean, if you look at it, 99% male. So, and the median full-time annual salary for the city is $68,000. So overall, these highly segregated titles are making a lot more than the average for the median. Okay. This is a very important one. Does occupational segregation affect all races and ethnicities equally? Now we don't have time. So you can see what we did was we created a new dyad. Instead of having individual race and ethnicity, black, white, Hispanic, black, Asian, what we did was we lumped in everyone into white and non-white, just to see where that led us. And what we found was a little concerning. So with this, we found that the occupational segregation for the white-black dyad was much higher than the white, non-white dyad, okay? So, and we actually see that the white Hispanic dyad is much lower than that. In fact, all of them are lower than that, with the exception of black-white dyad, all right? So what we're seeing here is that if we're looking at this sort of comparison of white, non-white, most of it is attributed to the occupational segregation between whites and blacks. So now this is a little colorful, but I'll do my best to point out the little numbers. So these are the 6 job groups with the greatest imbalances between whites, blacks, and non-whites. What these dotted lines, so fire supervisors, firefighters, lawyers, social workers, okay? These dotted lines that go across here, that's the overall city workforce percentage. That's the entire, across the entire city. From our data, which does not include health and hospitals and the DO and school construction. However, if you look at these, you're going to see some interesting trends. The white-black occupational segregation is actually more pronounced than the white-Hispanic and white-Asian segregation. Blacks and whites are pretty evenly represented in the city workforce, for both at like 35-ish, all right, 21%. Now, when you look at these particular job groups, for example, now social workers, for example, that's a bunch of different titles. higher supervisors is like lieutenant, chief, and those. So it's a number of different titles that are actually in these jobs. All right. But what we see here is that this percentage of the workforce of that workforce is very high for WITs. All right. For example, the lawyers, 63%, 64% white. All right. That is much higher than the 35% of the actual city workforce. Another example, the clerical supervisor, which you remember from another table I had, being a large contributor. They are 62% black, all right? And that is far higher than the 35% black overall workforce. So, given these titles that are particularly segregated, they are segregated specifically for one dialect, and that's the black. So, the next steps. We talked a little bit about this with some of the earlier presentations in terms of leadership buy-in and everything. But my opinion, I always go with gather data. Get as much as you can. Get as much information as you can. When we're looking at this, we're coming up with these research questions. We looked at every source that we could get our hands on, like I said, and that includes SEAF reports and applicant tracking data, onboarding and exit surveys. Anything you can find, look for trends, look for anomalies, look for outliers, any of that stuff, explore it. You can calculate the agency dissimilarity index. Okay, it's not complex. All that algebra, it's not as much of a big deal as you think, and it can be worked down into a couple columns in an Excel spreadsheet. Conducting barrier analyses for underutilized and overutilized groups, because overutilized groups also contribute to occupational segregation. So, and then consider this cross-training, succession planning, and transference of knowledge, skills, and abilities, because that is going to, while this is a very broad thing to say, oh, just try cross-training or succession planning, these are things that could tip the scales a little bit, but worth looking into. Thank you very much. And so, in the interest of time, what we're going to do is we're going to roll my Q&A session into our panel Q&A session. So you will have the opportunity to ask me a question or our other distinguished speakers. So get everybody up here and we can start with that session.
I just wanted to know, it was a lot of information that we had to digest today. Will you be sharing your presentations?
Yes, we can share the presentations. We'll put the presentations on the website.
Patrick, those were pretty brief numbers. So, as a fellow lawyer, I can tell you that while there are a lot of female lawyers in public service, there aren't a whole lot of female lawyers who are heading law firms. And that, what you were showing us, I believe, is a law firm. At best, it's 800 members, which blows my mind, because when I was in city government, it was 600, and it wasn't that many years ago. But that being put aside for a moment, using lawyers as a stimulus and as the example and the focus, and I ask all four really, how do you increase the pool? Because the pool has to be coming out of the law schools, and therefore, how do you increase the pool for the people that aren't represented? So it's, I know my own law school now is over 50% female, but how many of them can afford to go into public service, which is one of the huge issues right now facing law schools and all, including this one. And how do you therefore change the workforce? Because if you don't change the pool, we're going to continue this for 330 years. I know I won't be alive then. So I'm troubled by it, and since it's the one area job title I know about, it really is particularly troubling to me. I will admit that I was nasty enough to ask the chief corporate counsel under the last mayor why all the pictures that I was looking at were white male. Actually, there were two colored corp counsels within the city. And he asked me whether I wanted him to change his sex, and I said I hadn't thought of that. But in truth, that's the problem. The models aren't there, the mentors aren't there. How do we change it for the lawyers for one, or change it for the workforce?
Make law school free?
Maybe. They're coming out with in excess of $100,000 worth of debt.
So I would say, I talked a little bit, and Kim did too, about accountability and transparency. So there's a pipeline of people leaving law schools, and they have a gender composition which is pretty much 50-50 or 60-40. And that pipe, one could ask, when the Corporation Council is making its hiring decisions, does its applicant pool look like the pipeline? And if the answer is no, then they have some answering to do. Right? And so that's about having accountability relative to some metric. But if you don't have a metric, then you can't hold someone accountable. Right? You also have to have someone in a powerful enough position to do that. And I'd also point out that there's something to be gained from transparency here, which is if everybody, including the people at lower levels in the organization, understands or has access to the metrics, not just the people in HR, not just the people in leadership positions, then that also means you have a bottom-up accountability. This is not just about lawyers. I think this is about any metric you can do.
So I'm going to come at the question a little bit differently. I think that we focused today a lot on employment practices, and at that level, some of my other research has really been looking at adolescents and how they form occupational aspirations, recognizing that the pipeline just doesn't start at the point of applying to your jobs in your organizations or your agencies. One of the things, this isn't so true with gender, but certainly with race and ethnicity, students of color want to become lawyers, right? So if you look at them in 8th grade and 10th grade, they want to become lawyers, but they drop out of the pipeline going throughout. And some of that is, yes, the cost of law school, but some of it appears even before. And they, I think one of the arguments out there is they see the segregation that exists in the real world, and then they adjust their aspirations according to what they see and what's possible for people like them. I was talking in the break with a gentleman about, is it really the right place to be looking at employment practices to solve some of these broader problems? I would say no. I would say that if you wanted to put public resources into one program that would actually reduce some of these inequalities that we all see in our organizations, it would be universal pre-K. It would be solving housing problems, right? So at some level, I wrestle with this a lot at Cornell. Cornell has very generous financial aid programs and very extreme efforts to try and increase representation and so forth. By the time the kids are 18, it's too late, right? This is maybe not the point, this isn't even getting on my soapbox, but the point here is that a lot of these broader issues about representation and inequality, you need a much more comprehensive set of programming that's not just within your own organizations, and you need to start a lot earlier in the life course. to actually try and address some of these inequalities.
I knew it in sixth grade.
To follow up on that, I wonder if you've looked at the use of internships and mentioned pipelines, that you can elaborate on pipelines and internships, please?
So, because we're in the Q&A section, I'm just going to go ahead and put it out there. I think internships are the tool of the devil. And why do I say that? Because you think about who can afford to work for a summer for free in New York City without pay. It's rich kids, right? So again, we run into this at Cornell a lot of trying to develop programming to give some of our students hands-on research experience. But the students that you really want to have those experiences are not those that can afford to take them. And you also might think about whether internships are basically exploited labor, right? I mean, you're basically having somebody work for you without paying them or paying them very, very little. So I mean, I think that the internships are a way that you might be able to get experiences and get social capital, so those contacts for a certain group of people. But we have to solve the access problem in internships first and foremost. Otherwise, they're just going to be exacerbating a lot of these inequalities as opposed to really addressing them in any meaningful way. Well, that managed to shut down conversation.
It's lunchtime, that's why.
How about other forms of pipelines
Earlier on, there was someone made a proposal, it was the woman who was interested in getting men into those managerial jobs. And so one of the arguments that was being made there was, well, maybe what we need is to promote from within instead of hire from without, right? So, I mean, in some ways, one can think of pipelines that way, right? I venture to guess that almost everybody in this room went through a college somewhere, and thus you assume that going through a college somewhere is the appropriate pipeline, right? Because I did. I spent all the time in college. And so, so maybe there's an issue here where we can rethink what's appropriate to move someone into a job. It might be that it's possible to promote from within, to laterally promote across jobs, or in the case of the problem of Cornell, moving from kind of prestigious universities to CUNY, in kind of the notion of what's appropriate. I would like to point out, in my mind, and kind of at the theoretical level, I think when people discriminate on the basis of race or on the basis of gender, whether it's positive or negative discrimination, it's not that different from discriminating on the basis of some kind of class signal, right? That the cognitive processes are quite the same.
But to kind of build, like when you were talking about internships and even talking about this pipeline, I know, and we run into that too with the internships. It's like we can afford to live in DC, and we do pay our interns, but it is very little, relatively little. But we also create like fellowships that pays them enough to come, to be able to live. And of course, we're limited in how many of these we can do, but we do, when we can, we will bring in as many fellows where they get to come in, they get to join the community, they get to meet people, make contacts. And this is research internships, so they actually do get to do the research and get their name put on stuff that we put out. And so I think that's another way of bringing people in, making sure people are beginning to make those connections, because I think that's also really important. It's for people to have connections in the field and feel like they actually will be able to get a fair shake after they've invested in that education.
So I'm going to talk about something else that came up, and I'm hungry as well. So Dr. Whedon went through these various kinds of familiar practices, many of which have disappointing results. If she had gone on longer, she could have had a longer list of kind of what are the employment practices that are fairly widespread now that have very limited effects. that most of these things are actually not about the outcomes. They're about the process, right? So we put in this EEO statement, right? Or maybe we try to treat people about cognitive bias or something like that. But if you think about managerial decisions or other stuff, right? You worry about, is the park clean, right? It's the outcome, it's not the process, right? And so in that sense, what we have is a bunch of HR practices that we have a theory, most of the theories being theories that were arrived at somewhere between 1964 and 1975. We have a theory that if we change this process, it will change this outcome. At this point, it's probably pretty clear to you and your organizations that many of these things don't change the outcome, right? So doubling down on those processes is not the solution. Right? I think, and this is why I'm always talking about measuring things and transparency, accountability, those are the outcomes. Focus on the outcomes.
All right.
All right.
Mike over here.
Yeah, I think there's a,
Just have a quick question. You were, Dr. Childers, when you were showing your graph that had the number of individuals who would be in health and be in different sectors. So number one was 100,000 people that were growing sectors, basically.
The project application.
Yeah, applications that were growing. A lot of the work that I do is encouraging young people to pursue careers in science, technology, engineering, and math. And so I was struck by the fact that the people that were in that particular section were 19,000 or something like that, in contrast to the 100,000, but not in healthcare, but in healthcare actually being home aides, right? And so I just wondered kind of how do you think about that in terms of the fact that we're pushing so many people to be in an area that may not be in fact the largest growing?
Well, I still think it is worthwhile to encourage people to look at STEM occupations. But I think for me, when I focus on that graph, my focus is on improving the jobs that have to be done. It's not to say that people should not continue to move into other occupations. Those are the largest number of new jobs created, but they're still, and I honestly don't know the comparison of the size of those two occupations. But I think that a lot of the new jobs, a lot of where we're going, as automation and other processes impacts work, it still will require a workforce that is better educated and prepared. And even some of those healthcare jobs are going to start requiring some STEM skills. So I do kind of foresee some ability to upgrade some of those occupations, given that we make those investments. And so I think I see some of that coming with that technology being infused into some of the healthcare practice. And how far down the road that is, I don't know. But I know, like with telemedicine now, with stuff like that, we are seeing that kind of being introduced. But I still think that STEM jobs, that preparing people for those types of jobs, that's still going to be an important part of the workforce.
So on that topic, in today's times, the thing that was not about yesterday's hearings was that the New York City area airports are all going to have an $18 an hour minimum wage. Right? That's how you pull up those jobs.
I think this mic is on. It's okay. On behalf of the EEPC, I want to thank you for attending our conference today. I want to thank our Executive Director, Sharice Terry. I want to thank Dr. Tom Tomaskovic. Dee, I love it. It must be your mother and father's name.
Wife and husband.
Wife and husband. Dr. Chandra Childers and Dr. Kim Eden, and our leading us through this important discussion. And we find it important because the EPC wants to minimize barriers to equal employment. That is our charter. We think today our conference that was based on occupational segregation and its impact on individual salary growth and achievement showed you what we are looking at and what we think about. I think our own Patrick Boyle's presentation gave us pause showing occupational segregation within New York City. But you are part of the answer. I hope that today's conference opened up some areas where you gave you some thoughts for what to do going forward in the future. I know it did to me. We hope our audits, which we unfortunately, you know we do all the time, and its findings help you to create a more equitable workforce, one with more employment parity before 330 years pass. We gotta be a model, guys. We can't be the norm. So thank you again for attending. Please reach out to us. My name's Commissioner Lane Reese. There's Commissioner Rice. Two of our other commissioners, one apparently here today, the other one is left. But we're here. We're here to help. We're here as our staff to help answer and help you through it all. I have been an employee of the City of New York. I have asked the Corp Council how come there aren't any women on that, pictures of women in the legal department, but that's only the outcome. You're part of the input, you're part of changing that outcome. So thank you again for attending, and please join me in applauding our speakers.